Hi everybody, welcome back to English 90. This is for our class for Wednesday on the 27th, where I wanted to transition a little bit. Thus far this semester, we've been talking about the kinds of writing assignments that you would be doing in school, but I wanted to also talk about the kind of writing assignment that is related to searching for a job, specifically resumes and cover letters, which luckily has some connections with what we've been talking about thus far, but there are also some differences as well. And I had assigned an essay that's included in our textbook about how to do well on a job interview. So I thought I would talk about that today. And then next class, we can go back to the idea of writing essays, and I can talk a little bit about your next paper assignment. So in terms of resumes, so some general suggestions that basically you want to be brief, you want to be clear, and you want to be neat. And studies have shown that the average employer will spend less than 1 minute looking at your resume. So you want it to be something that can be easily scanned. And you want basic information on that resume, things like your name, your contact information, your education, your work experience, your awards, other skills that could be applicable. For instance, if you speak another language, including sign language, that would be a great thing to put down. And usually what we put on a resume is in the references section, references available upon request. But you should already have 3 references lined up so that if you are called by an individual for an interview and they ask you for your references, you're able to provide those references at that point in time. And you want to make sure that you've got the permission of your references to be able to share that. So it's always a good idea when you are on the job hunt to have 3 references already in place. Again, they don't necessarily need to be listed on your resume, but they should be readily available. And you want to make sure that these are references that can say good things about you. You'd be surprised. I've been on a number of search committees and how often the references are not as strong as you would expect them to be. One of the things that I suggest too is that if you are leaving a place of employment, or let's say you're leaving school and you have an individual who you think would be a good reference for you, that you ask them to write you a letter of reference or recommendation at that point in time while they still remember you very well, so that if it turns out that you need to use them in the future as a reference, you can contact them and they at least have some information about you so that they can refresh your memory. Or you can resend back the letter that they had initially written for you so that they can refresh their memory, especially if there's been a good amount of time that has elapsed. Definitely, you want to make sure that there are no mechanical errors, because part of what employers are looking for is your ability to write as well as your job experience. Now, I know that there are jobs that you don't need to submit in a resume or a cover letter, but usually when we're talking about salaried positions, the kinds of positions that actually you're preparing for when you go to college, you are expected more frequently than not to hand in a resume, which basically just lists your employment history, and as I indicated, your education, your contact information, things like that, and also a cover letter. Now, there are lots of different ways to write resumes. One is not necessarily better than another, but I did include on the bottom of our section on resumes, which is section 1 in our notes, a link that will give you a sample resume for you to look at. And I've also done the same thing with cover letters. Basically, a cover letter is just a separate letter that accompanies the resume that basically details things like, again, your work history. It's highlighting those important pieces in the resume, not necessarily all of the resume, but those elements in the resume that you definitely wanted to ensure that an employer paid attention to. And in terms of the cover letter, you've usually got what we've been talking about in terms of threes. You've got an introduction, you've got a body, and you've got a conclusion, which is what your next writing assignment is going to be about, by the way. I'm still working on your paragraph writing assignments. I've fallen a little bit behind with my grading, but I will get those back to you before you hand in your second writing assignment, which happens to be an assignment where I'm going to ask you to write 3 or more paragraphs. And basically, you will be writing an introductory paragraph, an entire paragraph devoted just to introducing the reader to your topic. And then you will have a body paragraph that gives your evidence and your details. And then you will have a concluding paragraph that basically is an entire paragraph that's devoted to giving closure to your particular essay. So basically, it's very similar to what you would do when you write a paragraph, when you've got your topic sentence, your supporting sentences, and your concluding sentence. So once you learn how to write a paragraph, you can take those skills and transfer them over to writing an essay. And you always have to do an introduction. You always have to do a conclusion. So basically, the question is, how many body paragraphs do you want to add? And you can add as many as you like. The difference between a 2-page paper and a 200-page paper is just based on the number of body paragraphs that you have, the number of pieces of evidence that with details that you are including. So if you can write a good introductory paragraph and a good concluding paragraph, then it's just a question of developing your pieces of evidence, as we'll discuss when we talk a little bit more about our second writing assignment. But keep in mind that one of the criteria for writing a resume and a cover letter is that it should be easy to read, because again, employers will spend probably less than a minute reviewing your resume, and that includes the cover letter as well. So you want to make sure that your introduction just very clearly states what job you're applying to, and be specific, because you could be applying at a corporation or at a place of employment where there are multiple positions that are available. And then in your body paragraph, you want to give brief highlights of your resume. And then at the ending, you just basically want to reiterate, that you're interested in the position and this is your contact information. And I've got a sample cover letter link, and this is in part 2 of the notes below. And again, this is just a sample, but it'll give you an idea. Notice that both of these samples come from the same place, Indeed.com. Now, Indeed.com is a wonderful place in terms of looking for employment opportunities. One of the things you want to keep in mind is that we are an internet-driven society, and that's what part 3 of the notes below happen to be about, social media. So I always recommend that you review and you update your social media. You want to eliminate anything that could present you in a negative light, because there is a possibility that employers will be checking your social media sites to get information about you. And even if you have the settings set to private, you never know where errors can occur. And there are many stories of individuals who have lost jobs and lost scholarships because they thought their settings were set to private and they weren't. Or it turns out that they did have private settings, but one of the people that they sent that particular message to in their private settings decided to send that message off to someone else, and things take a life of their own on the internet. So really look at the pictures and the posts that you've made and delete anything that could be considered compromising. And in terms of thinking about where to go to get additional information about jobs, GCC has a career services office. You can see that I've got some information about how you can contact them. And we also have a GCC online job board, and there's some information about how to contact them, as well as a GCC career exploration site, and there's some information on how to contact them. And that LinkedIn that I was talking about, the professional social media site that ultimately is used by so many professionals, that I really encourage you to set up a site on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is very similar to something like Facebook. The difference is that it's devoted to specific professional contacts. So it's not like Facebook where you're supposed to try, or any other social media site where you're supposed to try to get as many followers or as many likes as possible. possible. That's not the point. What you want to do is to have a possibility for networking, which means that you've got connections of individuals that you think are people who can help forward your career in one way or another. And you can upload a copy of your resume on LinkedIn, which I encourage you to do if you are actively searching. I don't necessarily have a copy of my resume on LinkedIn because I'm not actively searching, but I do have a summary of my work history so that you can get a little bit of a sense of who I am and some of the professional activities that I'm involved in. So I encourage you to set up an account, which you can do for free, and they'll give you basic services. You need to pay an additional fee to have additional services, but the basic account at least will allow you to have some sort of an electronic presence on a very respected job site. And that said, this is also a place where you can upload things like letters of recommendation. And I've got two actually that are uploaded there. They're both from the past, but they will give you a sense of what former colleagues, for instance, might have thought about my performance. And also, if I ever needed those individuals as current references, I could contact them and tell them that they could refresh their memory by reading the letters that I had posted on LinkedIn that they had written for me. So that's a good place to kind of house letters of recommendation. So, in terms of the essay, how to do well on a job interview, because ultimately your resume and your cover letter is supposed to serve one purpose, which is just to get you the interview. And then once you've got the interview, you're starting all over again. So, you can see that I've basically outlined and highlighted the major pieces of that particular essay. Present yourself as a winner. So you want to dress appropriately for the job. And I understand that that might be different based on the kind of job to which you are applying. Be well groomed, always. Look alert and friendly, even if you don't necessarily feel alert or friendly. Act. And expect that there's going to be a little bit of small talk, for instance, about the weather, or if you needed to commute to the interview, what the commute was like, or if you're doing it via Zoom, did you have difficulties logging into Zoom, whatever the case may happen to be. Also, what you want to do is to try to anticipate the interviewer's questions. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to determine what an interviewer is going to be asking you. But that said, there are usually some general questions that most interviewers ask. Things like, tell me about yourself. So you should prepare ahead of time if somebody were to ask you that question or something comparable, that you would have something to say. Or what are your strengths and weaknesses? That's also a very common question. I've been on many search committees at GCC, and I'm always surprised at the number of people who are not ready to respond to their weaknesses. Now, I know that this is a tricky question because you don't want to have a really strong weakness that is going to eliminate you from the position. But there are ways that you can present weaknesses as strengths. The idea that you tend to be a perfectionist, but that you're trying to, realize that, or at least work on the idea that things just need to be, satisfactory. They don't necessarily have to be perfect. Things of that nature is a way that you could turn a weakness into a strength. Why should we hire you? And you should definitely have an answer to that, because if you don't, there's a very high likelihood they're not going to hire you. Why did you leave your last job? Or why are you leaving your last job? Again, this can be tricky if it turns out that it was a job in which you didn't perform well or you left on bad terms. You can't lie on an interview, but you can definitely pick and choose those pieces of information that you share. So for instance, if your last job was a job that lasted only 2 weeks, there isn't necessarily a reason why you would have to share that with an employer. Now, obviously, or a prospective employer. Obviously, if you had a job that you had for 2 years, now you're going to have to talk about some of the reasons why you want to leave or you were asked to leave or whatever the case may happen to be. Almost every interview will end the same way with the question, do you have any questions? You should always have a question. Do not say no. And this is not the time to ask questions about things like salary or working conditions. This is the time to ask a question that will be impressive to your employer. So, asking something about the company or asking something about the position, you definitely want to do your research ahead of time so that you know a little bit about the organization to which you are applying. And again, in the world of the internet, it's sort of expected that you would do your homework, so to speak. There are some general questions usually that work pretty well for just about any job, where you get to ask, what do you see as the biggest challenge of this position? Or what do you think is the most rewarding piece of this position? Or what are the opportunities for growth in this position? There are things like that that you can ask, but there are probably also some specific questions that would also illustrate that you've done your homework. So this might be a place for you to say that you were looking at, let's say, their website and you notice that their profit margins have increased over the last 6 months. And do they anticipate that trend to continue? This is a great opportunity and way for you to show that you care about the job because you did your research and you were able to highlight something important about the company. So, after the interview, what most people are not doing anymore, that I definitely recommend that you do to set yourself apart from the crowd, is to send a thank you note. Something that's brief, but positive as well about your experience. Even if your experience wasn't positive, this might be a chance for you to perhaps tell a little white lie and say that you're excited about the possibility of working there, that you enjoyed the interview. This is something you wanted to emphasize if there was a piece that you wanted them to pay particular attention to. And also, again, reiterate your contact information and that you look forward to hearing from them. So it's just a nice way to show that ultimately, you're still following some of the conventions of good manners. So that's in a nutshell, some of the suggestions that I would give in terms of employment. And we'll talk a little bit more about this next class as well. But next class, we will move into basically talking about paper number 2 and also talking about other punctuation marks. We left off the last class with the comma, which tends to oftentimes be a very challenging piece of punctuation. There are other pieces of punctuation too that you don't use it nearly as frequently as the comma, such as the colon or perhaps the apostrophe. And I wanted to talk about those next class. And also remind you that your next journal number 3, is going to be due, if you're watching this on Wednesday, Wednesday the 27th at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And this is an article which is listed again in the bottom of our notes about the connection between stress and physical illness, as well as emotional illness. So I thought that particularly as we are in that midpoint in the semester, which can tend to be very stressful, this might be a very useful reading to do at this particular point in time. And as you are probably aware, we are very close to Halloween, and which happens to be one of my favorite days. And I wanted to let you know, if you happen to be a fan of Halloween, or if you happen to be a fan of horror film, and I'm a fan of both, that I'm going to be giving a presentation on horror film. I actually teach a class at GCC about media and popular culture and horror film. And it's being sponsored by the Lava Center, which is in downtown Greenfields, that is basically running a series on the arts. And my presentation is entitled Ticket to Terror, Horror Film in the Age of Anxiety. And it'll last somewhere between an hour to an hour and a half. It will be Saturday, October 30th, 1 p.m. And it's free. So if it turns out that you wanted to attend, I've included 2 links. One where you can pre-register for Zoom, and you can do that at www.localaccess.org. That's through the Lava Center. And also you can just go directly to my Zoom link. And this is the Zoom link I use for classes as well. And that's 702-819-0433. So if you are a horror film fan, I'm going to be talking about the history of horror film, from its origins in the 1920s to contemporary times. So, in terms of today's attendance question, I thought we would go back to the idea of employment strategies. And this will be due on Thursday, the 28th at 10 a.m. Which piece of job search advice did you find to be the most useful and why? Which piece of job search advice that I've shared with you today did you find to be the most useful and why? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class by talking about punctuation and paper number 2. Take care. Bye bye.